Have you ever been laughed at for trying to protect your own home? That's exactly what happened to me. The HOA board mocked my flood wall, called it ugly, unnecessary, and demanded I remove it immediately. But only minutes later, a sudden storm proved why I'd built it in the first place, and the same people who laughed at me were desperately trying to save their own homes. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm a retired civil engineer, and after 30 years of designing flood control systems across the country, I decided to settle down in a quiet neighborhood near a scenic river. The homes were beautiful, the community looked peaceful, and everything seemed perfect, until I met the HOA. When I bought the property, I carefully reviewed historical flood maps. Something immediately caught my attention. Although the neighborhood hadn't experienced major flooding in years, the terrain naturally directed stormwater straight toward the subdivision. Climate patterns had also become more unpredictable. To me, it wasn't a question of if flooding would happen again. It was simply when. So I invested nearly $80,000 building a reinforced decorative flood wall around my property. It wasn't an ugly concrete barrier. I covered it with natural stone, added landscaping, and even planted flowers along the edges. Most visitors couldn't even tell it was designed for flood protection. Unfortunately, the HOA president, Karen Mitchell, noticed. One Saturday morning she walked onto my driveway with two board members. "Mr. Carter," she said confidently, "that wall violates community aesthetics." I calmly replied, "It's fully permitted by the county." She smiled sarcastically. "We don't care what the county says. The HOA decides what's acceptable here." I showed them engineering reports, permits, and drainage studies. They barely looked. Karen folded the papers and handed them back. "You have 30 days to remove this joke of a wall." I simply smiled. "I won't." That answer made her furious. Over the next several weeks, the HOA began sending violation notices almost daily. Unauthorized structure, improper landscaping, visual obstruction, failure to comply. The fines kept increasing. Neighbors slowly started avoiding me because Karen kept telling everyone I was lowering property values. One afternoon, my next-door neighbor quietly came over. He whispered, "Daniel, I actually think you're right about the flooding." But nobody wanted to argue with Karen. I nodded. I understand. Meanwhile, weather forecasts started predicting an unusually powerful storm system moving toward our area. Most residents weren't worried. Karen certainly wasn't. At the monthly HOA meeting, she actually laughed while showing pictures of my flood wall on a projector. "Look at this fortress," she joked. The room erupted with laughter. Someone shouted, "Planning for Noah's Ark." Everyone laughed again. I stood quietly in the back. Then I simply said, "I sincerely hope none of you ever need protection from rising water." Karen rolled her eyes. "We'll take our chances." 3 days later, the storm arrived. Rain fell harder than anyone expected. Within an hour, nearby creeks overflowed. Storm drains became overwhelmed. Water started flowing exactly where my engineering models had predicted years earlier, straight toward the neighborhood. I activated small drainage gates built into my flood wall. Everything worked perfectly. Water flowed around my property and safely into designated channels. My yard stayed dry. Across the street, things looked very different. Water poured over sidewalks. Garages filled first, then basements, then living rooms. People suddenly realized the danger. Cars started floating down the street. Trash bins slammed into fences. Outdoor furniture disappeared beneath muddy water. I watched from my porch as Karen stood ankle-deep in water screaming into her phone. She finally noticed my property. Not a single inch of standing water. My home looked completely untouched. She stared in disbelief. Then she ran toward my gate. "Daniel." I opened it. She looked completely terrified now. "Our house is flooding." I nodded quietly. "I know." She pointed toward my wall. "Can you help us?" There was no anger in her voice anymore, only panic. I immediately grabbed extra water pumps I'd kept in storage. Within minutes, I was helping several neighbors move valuables upstairs. Despite everything the HOA had done to me, I wasn't about to watch families lose everything. For nearly 6 hours, we worked nonstop. Emergency crews eventually arrived. By sunrise, the storm had passed. Entire sections of the neighborhood had suffered severe water damage. Insurance inspectors began documenting everything. A week later, county engineers visited the neighborhood. After reviewing drainage patterns, they reached an interesting conclusion. My flood wall hadn't redirected water onto neighboring properties. Instead, it had actually slowed and stabilized water flow around one entire section of the subdivision. Several nearby homes experienced less damage because of the wall. The county publicly praised the design. Then something even more surprising happened. Insurance investigators requested copies of my engineering reports. They discovered I predicted nearly every flooding pattern with remarkable accuracy years before the disaster. Local news stations interviewed county officials. Soon my flood wall became an example of proactive disaster preparation. Meanwhile, the HOA board faced difficult questions. Residents demanded to know why they'd spent months trying to force removal of a safety feature that actually helped the community. Karen attempted to defend herself. We were only enforcing appearance standards. Nobody accepted that explanation anymore. Several homeowners revealed emails showing they had also wanted better flood protection, but abandoned their plans because the HOA discouraged them. Attendance at the next HOA meeting was overwhelming. Dozens of frustrated residents packed the room. One elderly homeowner stood up. If Daniel had listened to this board, his house would have flooded too. Another neighbor added, and some of ours would have been even worse. Karen had no response. Within weeks, 3 board members resigned. Karen eventually stepped down as president after a community vote. A newly elected board immediately changed the neighborhood guidelines. Flood protection improvements would now be encouraged, not punished. Several neighbors even asked if I could help design protective drainage systems for their own homes. I gladly agreed. Months later, the neighborhood looked different, not because of expensive decorations or fancy landscaping, but because people finally understood that preparation isn't something to laugh about. One evening, I was planting flowers along my flood wall when the same neighbor who had quietly supported me months earlier walked over. He smiled. "You know." "What?" He laughed softly. Turns out that ugly wall saved the nicest house in the neighborhood. I smiled. "No." He looked confused. "It saved much more than that." Sometimes the strongest walls aren't built to keep people out. They are built to protect everyone when no one else believes the danger is real. And that's a lesson our neighborhood will never forget.